Okay, welcome. We're going to get underway here. Thank you so much for joining us here. My name is Alex de Sherbinin. I'm one of the co-chairs of this conference along with Radley Horton, who's on a train that was delayed because of weather conditions, of all things, coming down from on the Metro North line. So we're delighted to have you here at this conference at What Point Managed Retreat, Resilience Building in the Coastal Zone. We welcome you to New York and to Columbia University. This conference is one of the flagship events of the Earth Institute's Adaptation initiative, and we're just delighted to have you here. For those of you who were able to attend last night's kickoff panel, I think we can all attest that it was an excellent start to the conference. Today's plenary is more of a stage setting for the breakout sessions today and tomorrow. We will begin with an introduction and framing by Andy Revkin, who's an award-winning environmental writer who spent 14 years as a reporter at the New York Times before moving on to his widely cited .earth blog. Andy will introduce our three plenary speakers, and then after each presenter has had a chance to present, he will invite all of them to the front for a dialogue and some further discussion with the audience. At this point, I'd like to remind you of the goals of this conference. The first goal is to convene scientists, policymakers, planners, business leaders, and the media and other stakeholders to advance an interdisciplinary dialogue on a topic that has not been explored much in depth. I believe the goal is already in the process of being achieved by you all being here. Our second goal is to weigh the costs and benefits of managed retreat. That term itself is somewhat contested, as we heard last night, so we can discuss whether managed should be in retreat or not. We can all maybe have some discussion around that topic. But we want to weigh the costs and benefits of that versus resilience building or reinforcement of coastal areas and defenses for communities in a range of contexts from urban to rural with varying levels of risk. We will be hearing more about this aspect this morning and in many breakout sessions over the next 2 days. Our third goal is to identify best practices and likely policy options for managing coastal retreat in these different contexts, borrowing from best practices globally. Over the next 2 days, you will be hearing about case studies from many regions around the world, including cases from the Mississippi Delta of Louisiana, Newtok and Chevelina in Alaska, Norfolk, Virginia, Miami, Florida, and the Metro New York area, among many others, including some internationally. We'll hear about successes and challenges, from policy barriers to economic disincentives, and through this sharing, we'll be able to inform the good work that many of you are already carrying out in your respective localities. Tomorrow morning, all participants will receive a survey, or may go out later today, but this survey link will be essentially an opportunity for you to list some of the take-home messages that you came away from at this conference, and also what you hope to do and what kind of collaborations or new opportunities you see as you're going back to your home areas. We encourage everyone to fill out the survey, and we'll use that to shape the final plenary tomorrow afternoon at 5 p.m. Speaking of plenaries, we're going to have one more plenary today. That's at 5 p.m. Each of these plenaries, by the way, there is no break between the afternoon breakout and the 5 p.m. plenary. So you'll need to make your way quickly, and we encourage the session chairs to bring those sessions to a close rapidly so that people can make their way in here. So tonight we have a great theater event staged by our friends at the University of New Hampshire, followed by the screening of the film Managed Retreat with an open discussion with the film's director, Nathan Kensiger, so you will not want to miss that. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the members of the conference organizing committee, all of whom are listed on the conference homepage. If you're a part of the organizing committee, can you just stand up so we can acknowledge you now? Okay, there's a few more, I think. And I'd especially like to thank Haley Martinez. If she's in the room, she's in the back. So without Haley's steady hand and attention to detail, we would not be here today. And we want to thank her team as well. She has a terrific team assembled to help us. So we'd also like to encourage you to tweet about the conference using the conference hashtag Twitter, Twitter hashtag Managed Retreat CU 2019, and if you'd like to be part of a larger dialogue on Managed Retreat, there's also a hashtag Managed Retreat. If there's anything we can do to make your stay here in New York more enjoyable, please do let us know. And with that, I'd invite Andy to come on up and to further set the stage for what I'm sure will be a great 2 days together. Thank you.
I love this. My dad had a furniture store, and this music is like the music. So can I sell you a couch? Yeah, right. No, actually, I was mostly cleaning the floors and stuff, but I did get to try salesmanship once, and my uncle was better. Yeah, so this is, I'm going to stop bringing this soon, but I had to show it again. This is 1988, the year Jim Hansen testified in the Senate that climate change from human buildup of CO2 was already discernible by his calculation. It was sort of a controversial stance at that point, and I began writing about this story at that point. Interestingly, I'm kind of happy that the headline, you don't choose the headlines, but the main spread was about living with the greenhouse effect. Now that feels like a bummer to those of us who've also been working really hard to convey the importance of curbing emissions of greenhouse gases. But as even Al Gore finally acknowledged in 2013, which he didn't do in 1992, it's a moral imperative to adapt as you mitigate. You can't, because of inertia, because of the basic physics of the system. It took him a long time. It took a lot of the environmental community a long time to sort of say, we need to do both aggressively now. And this conference is an amazing kind of example of an interdisciplinary practitioner interchange of the kind that's needed more and more. If this can ramify, you can have regional versions of this, not just for sea level rise, but for all the different components of risk that are coming at built vulnerability around the country and around the world. That would be a great thing. In 2000, so I've written, I don't know, probably 2,000 or 3,000, well, at least 2,000 blog posts, and 1,500 or so New York Times stories, plus some magazine stories on this issue through 30 years. And there was one moment in 2013 that's most relevant to the discussion today. Mayor Bloomberg, his final term in office, he had come out with this NYC plan, very creditable action on trying to make the city less emitting and more resilient. But the core of his speech that day, some of you might have been there, was "We will not retreat." There was a line in there that said, "New York's shoreline is its most precious asset. We're not going to retreat." And to me, it felt like a different kind of denialism. And here's a guy who was a UN envoy and the like. And this is I think one of the most important questions going forward is how do you frame this issue that, just as you heard from Alex, what words you use. It's beyond words, though. What strategies you use to engage communities in breaking away from old models and thinking about a city that can be floodable and still functional, as opposed to this seawall idea. We're going to discuss this in a few minutes. The equity issues are huge. So I kind of criticized the mayor in a blog post that day, 2013, on my Times blog. And I've not been blogging the last couple of years, so I could only tweet when Mayor de Blasio came out with his new plan, which is a $10 billion kind of extension of Lower Manhattan to protect the financial district. And I'm sure some of you, maybe you discussed this last night, this idea that you can safeguard a broader city by building something bigger. And the word reclamation, to all my marine science friends, this idea that reclamation, we're taking part of the Hudson River to make real estate is essentially what that plan feels like when you just step back. It would spread the risk, just as all those levees in the Midwest protect a zone for a while, but they basically channel water to create risks elsewhere. So the sea level issue was dealt with extensively in here. The range of possibilities in this article are the same as the range of possibilities now. You'll hear about a study that just came out recently that puts that 6 foot or 2 meter rise in the realm of the conceivable between now and 2100. But the same paper also raised the uncertainties around that. So again, if you're the mayor of a city, what does that tell you? Oh my God, I don't know. It tells you this is hard. So the one thing I've been doing since that point, back in 2013, when I wrote about the mayor, I said, so suppose you're the press secretary of the next mayor of New York City, after this one finishes his presidential run, whatever. And she says, I just read this new report, and write me a speech. Write me a speech that says we will retreat, Mr. Press Secretary. And think about what does that speech say? How do you write that speech? How do you get past the political barriers, economic barriers to the ideas that we grew up with in a period of stable sea levels? That's the mission of this meeting, as far as I know. It's kind of, how do you write that speech? And then not so much we know for sure that this isn't just about speechifying. It's about conversations. And there's a great unit at Columbia at the Earth Institute that shapes difficult conversations. That's Peter Coleman and others. So that's part of the process going forward. It's not just telling a better story. I've been doing that for 30 years, as many other people have, and the IPCC has been trying to do. It's engaging communities in new ways that focus on resilience, living with this, even as we work on decarbonization. So I hope let's get the panel up here and we'll get going. Come on up. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, right. Especially, yes. So rather than that,
the presenters now.
Yeah, switch to the first presenter.
right.
And just so you know, there are bios for all the presenters if you go to the conference homepage on your phones, and then you go to conference, and then daily schedule, you'll find the daily schedule for Thursday. Sorry, we're Thursday. So,
Right. So first up is Katharine Mach from Stanford, and she's, well, just read about her. She's been involved in this particular question for a long time, and she's going to lay out the basic science landscape that decision makers and communities have to work with. Come on up.
Thank you so much, Andy. So in some ways, after the amazing presentations last night and that riveting panel discussion, I think we have answered the question that I was supposed to kick off with here. Why are we talking about retreat? It's not a hypothetical. It's something that is already happening in the world around us, and one where we know that it will have a different role as the climate continues to change. So Radley clearly is very familiar with the classic underpinnings of how risk is conceptualized, so this will also be a recap. Ingredient number one when it comes to risk in a changing climate is hazards that are changing. These are, yes, the extreme sea level events, they're heavy rain, droughts, heat, fire, but these hazards are not enough to give us damages that matter in isolation. It's really how they intersect with people and with nature, where there's exposure, something in harm's way, and susceptibility to damage, vulnerability. So we as people are making choices across this spectrum of risk, not just through putting emissions of heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, but through all of the choices as to whether we deploy really strong building codes. Are we the house that survives or the house around that neighborhood? And also the major investments we make at societal scales, for example, including engineering investments. So scientists from around the world, of course, have been assessing what the state of science is on this issue for 3 decades now at the international scale. And one framework they have used to characterize risks most deserving of society's attention is a framework called Reasons for Concern. And so when I was thinking about why are we talking about retreat, I reflected on these major categories of risk really representing danger in a changing climate. And a few of them are particularly relevant to conversations about retreat. So first of all, there are the unique and threatened systems on the front line of a changing climate. For the most part, these are coastal, whether it's coral reefs at high risk at present or very high risk in the very near term, or as Robin described in powerful terms last night, the Arctic systems where the ice is disappearing, the frozen ground is melting, and profound rates of erosion and sudden collapse of land are occurring. These types of impacts already occurring are driving conversations on retreat in the present day. Category number 2 in the space of reasons for concern relevant to retreat is the category of extremes. Yes, these are extreme sea level events relevant to our predominant focus on the coastal zone over the next few days, but there are many other different hazards that are changing, and increasingly scientifically, we can tease out the role of our emissions of heat-trapping gases, not just in aggregate across these extremes, but event by event. That's pretty profound. And the last reason for concern that I will highlight is the potential for nonlinearities and tipping points in the Earth system. When we're talking about retreat, Exhibit A in this space is and must be the ice sheets. What will their contribution to sea level rise be? This has been a phenomenally exciting area of advance scientifically. Bob Kopp is here and will be giving one of the presentations this morning. And I think one of the key features here is that even as the science has accumulated, some of the uncertainties are pressing and deep. Exactly how stable will the ice sheets be in the second half of the century and beyond? If you run with some of the upper bounds for sea level rise in this century, they would put in year 2100 around 13 million Americans underwater permanently every year. Those numbers rise to about 200 million globally. So there are lots of reasons for concern in a changing climate, but the last gloomy thing I will emphasize here is that there are other reasons for concern as well, and they really come down to our patterns of development and how they have shaped disaster risk historically. This is a very hard to understand plot, but I'm going to just run with the fact that hopefully many of you have already seen it. It's from NOAA, and it is showing billion-dollar weather and climate events in the US since 1980 on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the amount of damages from those events. If you run up these numbers and tally them since 1980, it's over $1.6 trillion in losses. 2017 alone, with the major storm season experience, was over $300 billion in losses. Okay, but the good news is we can do some things to manage these risks. The classic trio deployed in conversations and actions in the space of flood risk management and coastal zone management is a good one to start with here. There are parallels when you're talking about other hazards, even though the terminology tends to shift. So number one, we can protect. We can deploy hard engineering, armor the coastline. There's great technological feasibility of the options in this category. And often, especially in urban environments, they're cost beneficial. Economically, they look good. But the hard thing is that they are expensive, and gathering the finances can be a key limiting factor in some regions. And there are also some important path dependencies for both people and nature, what happens when you armor that coastline. The second category here is accommodation, or essentially in very different ways, making way for the water. It can range from early warning systems, getting people out of the path of harm, through to building codes, elevation of critical infrastructure. I cherry-picked this particular image to demonstrate the line you often hear, which is that accommodation has its limits. So to this trio, you often now are increasingly hearing about the fourth that Andy briefly mentioned, advance, enter into the water in different ways. Ironically, that's something historically that we've been very good at, even though it has not been discussed in the climate context as well. But the third one I'll really hit here is retreat, moving structures out of the path of harm, returning that land to open space, floodplain, for example. It is perhaps the most socially, culturally, and politically complex of the options that we can deploy in this space. But before we get into all the challenges, as you'll hear over the next 2 days, it's worth emphasizing that there are some real benefits from retreat that are sometimes easy to overlook. So first of all, it can be a great way to reduce disaster risk. The house is no longer there, exposure plummets to nearly zero. This question of disaster risk reduction becomes more complex when you look at the full picture. So where do people move? Are they equally at risk? What is the net pattern of development that you see at a community or regional scale? But unambiguously, retreat can be a way to reduce risk. It also can benefit individuals and communities. And I think the key thing here is that there are a lot of people involved in any process of retreat. At a bare minimum, it'll be who's moving, who's left behind, and the communities that receive. The benefits can be economic and social, where these systems are well designed. There are also questions of culture and history that invariably come into play. A final basic category of benefit here is the role of nature and ecosystems in the space of retreat, where retreat can be a way to open up space for parks, to enable beaches to persist, to protect critical coastal habitat. These have benefits for people in terms of air quality, recreation, provision of ecosystem services in diverse ways. So as we talk about retreat, I think another reason that we are all here is that we are all looking at retreat as it is happening in the world around us. So I'll describe one study we did led by Miyuki Hino, who's here somewhere, but I don't see her, so she may be on this subway that is stuck as well. And we basically said a few years ago, what are all documented examples of managed retreat as it has been deployed in the world to date? 22 countries, 1.3 million people moved. There actually are a lot of lessons that can be derived from these experiences to date, where they've been both reactive in the aftermath of disaster, also proactive. Climate change has sometimes been invoked to date. And you can slice and dice these examples in many different ways to think about core themes, challenges, barriers, and opportunities. One simple way of depicting them is the x-axis here, are residents initiating the moves. So the big numbers towards this space of 1.3 million have come on the left side here, residents not actually initiating the move. As you can imagine, that can be very controversial, hotly contested, things that resemble exercises of eminent domain in different ways. But there are also, even on that side of the spectrum, some powerful examples of things that have worked. For example, the way that retreat has been deployed in the Netherlands Room for the River program, where the government negotiated door by door with several hundred households. These individual families weren't really the ones at risk, but by lowering the dikes and getting those houses out of there, you could protect large settlements downstream. On the other side of the spectrum, there are increasingly examples of residents initiating moves. As Robin described last night, the Alaskan villages, for example, that have been trying to relocate at a community scale for over 2 decades now in some cases, are profound examples of how hard this can be when governance systems don't exist. Those moves have not yet occurred in full, in any case. In the United States, in terms of the big numbers in the space of retreat, in particular in the context of flooding, it has been buyouts. I think this is the first conference I have ever been to that is going to have 3 full sessions on buyouts. So I'm not going to say that much, except for the fact that it is something that is happening in a widespread way across the US. This is just one figure from an analysis we've been doing, building from our collaborator Sider's emphasis on the fact that there's a lot to be derived by looking at a programmatic scale, making comparisons across these examples of buyouts to date. And, surprisingly enough, buyouts as a means of retreat have happened in 49 US states. Only Hawaii has not partaken yet through this FEMA-funded set of examples. These are examples that have also taken place in Puerto Rico quite abundantly. Comparing this programmatic scale view to what has happened case by case, we see some interesting contrasts. So first of all, buyouts are happening in places at risk of flooding. That's good. There are some interesting questions about who is able to partake at the level of the local government. It tends to be wealthier, more urban municipalities. And then by contrast, it's actually the more marginalized neighborhoods in many cases that are being bought out. For the full set of take-homes here, go to the 3rd session on buyouts, Friday afternoon, where Caroline Cron will be presenting this. So as you will hear at length, I'm sure, there is a profound preview of these themes on the panel last night. There are a lot of concerns about retreat as it has happened to date, whether that's ad hoc abandonment of land or through buyout practices. Number 1 on the list of concerns might be inequity. Those who have been forced to relocate. Those who might be trapped in place, at risk, wanting to move, but not able to gather the resources and capacity to do so. There are also real questions in terms of processes of implementation and whether they have been socially just. Another category of concern is that retreat to date has been rather incomplete. Developing patchworks of buyouts, for example, is not necessarily the most straightforward way to restore an area to open floodplain. There are also examples of incompleteness in terms of these community relocations that have started but failed to come to completion. And finally, in the space of retreat to date, there has sometimes been a myopic focus on the property at risk of flooding, devoid of the fact that this is a very rich territory for the human experience. Anything to do with land is all about societies, economies, cultures in profound ways, and there's real opportunity into the future to connect those dots. So as we think about how retreat will happen into the future, I think we can be certain that in pathways of adaptation, there's going to need to be iteration and an adaptive, flexible approach, especially given some of the uncertainties at hand. But there's also an opportunity to really be strategic in this space and to maximize benefits for societies. Lesson number 1 here might be the degree to which coordination is invariably an important part of the landscape of retreat across levels of governance, across different policy spheres. You kind of can't get around it if you're going to do retreat well. There's increasing opportunity to look at all of the hazards that are relevant in any one geography, and also to be integrated, not just to look at a given hazard in isolation, but how it intersects with that much broader backdrop of socioeconomics, culture, history, and the environment. And finally, there's an opportunity to perhaps at last figure out how to be proactive in the space of our adaptive responses, drawing in retreat, not just deploying retreat in the aftermath of disaster, but recognizing that into the future, there are going to be path dependencies that if we're not proactive, we need to be aware of, and there are real opportunities for this proactive approach to respond to market forces as well as the changing climate. A final slide that I'll end with is that we will hear over the next few days about a few different shades and forms of what managed retreat has looked like to date, whether that is through the buyouts or the examples of community relocation that we have discussed. But there are many different tools in the toolkit of retreat, and I think a really exciting feature moving forward is to think about how these options can be innovated and tested and vetted through evaluated processes through time to really enable learning in this space. The options for how retreat can happen are really diverse. They range from things that are more in the spaces of nudges, the setbacks, the easements, the way retreat can be incorporated in development plans that go far beyond risk in a changing climate. They're not just straight up funding, but how funding could potentially be paired with assistance in different forms, drawing retreat closer to economies, jobs, services, and culture, and all the priorities people have. And finally, there's the question of how we can deploy governance systems more effectively in the space of really achieving relocation at the community scale where it's desired. With that, I will save all questions, I think, for our open-ended discussion.
Some of those points were a great segue to the next presentations from the Shinnecock Indian Nation. If you can start to make your way toward the podium. That Dutch line reminded me, in 2007 in the New York Times, we did our first big package on what we called the climate divide globally. The rich have technology and money enabling them to become more resilient, the poor are not. And Sarah Lyle, as part of the package that I worked on, she interviewed a woman in Netherlands who had one of those houses that's designed to kind of float up and then come back down again. And she said, "We look forward to floating." You could Google for that phrase, "We look forward to floating," and the phrase climate divide, you find that piece. Meanwhile, another reporter interviewed a villager in India and another one in Malawi, and it wasn't like that. It wasn't, "We look forward to floating." So the equity issue is a keystone here, and history is a keystone too. So Siobhan Smith is a member of the Shinnecock tribe and resides in the territory of the eastern end of Long Island. She's director of the Shinnecock Environmental Department since 2011. You can learn more, obviously, in the program. And we hadn't had time to meet, so. Yeah, right. So, oh, well, if you're presenting at the same time, I'll introduce you both. And Chenae Bullock is enrolled Shinnecock Indian Nation member, descendant of the Montauk tribe in Long Island. They're sister tribes to several East Coast Algonquin tribes. I grew up in Rhode Island and learned a lot about our Native American culture there. I live in the Hudson Valley now, Lenape territory. As this building is in, we should thank everyone who lived here beforehand. So come on up.
Mama weena-ne, mama weena-ne, mama weena-ne, mama weena-ne, mama weena-ne, ne-ne me se nuag, mama weena-ne, oh hey, hey, oh hey, oh. Mama weena-ne, mama weena-ne, mama weena-ne, mama weena-ne, mama weena-ne, ne-ne me se nuag, mama weena-ne, oh hey, oh hey, oh. Nadasuisa Kampanayu Mishuna Tuiusqua, Wachi Pamanaki, Wachi Siwanhaki, Wachi Shinnecock, Wachi Montauk, Wachi Wyandots, Wachi Quashawam, Wachi Mangatuxi, Wachi Sassacus, Wachi Tadambam. My given name is I lead canoe, I am butterfly woman. I come from the island known to our people as Fish Island and the Island of Shells. I also descend from the Montauk community, just as stated before. And myself and my relative here, we're going to give a presentation on, it's a little difficult to see because the change from formatting from one laptop to another, I think we all can understand that. But it says relocation is more than a new address. So we're going to be co-presenting. So the first slide we have here, it talks about us as people of the Dawnlands. Just as stated before, even though I might be enrolled in the Shinnecock Indian Nation, I descend from the people that I just spoke about. We're sister tribes to the tribes here on the East Coast because we never put borders here. What you're looking at here is a project that was done by BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the University of Rhode Island Geosciences Department, as well as the Narragansett Indian Tribe Historical Preservation Office. And some of our sister tribes were involved in this, the marine archaeology report regarding our submerged paleo landscapes. During this time, as you can see, you're looking at Rhode Island. You're looking at what is now the Long Island Sound, but there was all land. And at the time, we followed the caribou. So now this is kind of what it looks like today. These are all of our tribes. We followed the caribou. We migrated together. We called ourselves Anishinaabe. To many scientists, you guys known us as Paleo Indians during the time, but we called ourselves Anishinaabe. We called ourselves the family. We extended from Maine all the way down into the Carolinas. And so what is in green essentially are recognized tribes, not only just of the federal recognized governments, but the state governments, and some are also historical. Here is a map that was done in about 1724 of what is now Southampton. Kind of towards the very bottom, you can see what it says, Shinnecock Great Neck. That is now our reservation. But at the time, what is in brown here is where the Shinnecock had lived, and we ended up leasing out a lot of our lands. So I'm going to kind of start into just more of a historical aspect. Sometimes we need to bring that, or most of the times we do need to bring that into the conversations that we're having when we're talking about retreat, because our ancestors, again, they followed the caribou, and they followed the buffalo. We followed the whales. We paid attention to what the animals were doing, and so we learned from them what was actually happening in the environment. And so if these are things that we've been practicing in our life ways, and I'll get into it in a little bit regarding the laws against our way of living. But we have a genetic relation to the land and the water. You know, the points in which our tribes have names like Shinnecock, meaning people of the stony shore, that talks about our connection to the water. You know, so we were semi-nomadic. We weren't nomadic people. At the time when we were contacted, we were not living directly on the beachfront. We were not living on the coastline. We were living in areas away from that. We also harvested with the seasons. You know, there are certain ways that we harvested our foods. We didn't hunt deer and caribou during certain times of year. That was for more so the winter times. So with it right now being Strawberry Thanksgiving, a lot of times we're finding that it's hard to find more and more wild strawberries. You know, these are things that we're paying attention to as Shinnecock people. We also traveled the world by carbon neutral vessels, known to many of us as canoes, known to us as mashoons in our language. So we didn't, you know, pollute the land, the water and the land, because we didn't build permanent structures. And these are things that, you know, we're slowly getting back to as well. There were also shellfishing traditions. There's a story that a Narragansett elder had told me, and I spoke with a Shinnecock elder actually last night, letting him know that I'm going to be giving this presentation because our elders can't always make it to these types of conferences. But a lot of the oral histories that we have, we pass down. But there's a story about how as shellfishermen, Narragansett shellfisherman was shellfishing in a pond. And in this pond, he brought 2 baskets when he came to the pond. One basket was particularly for all of the shells, all of the shellfish that he was fishing. He would put the small ones in one basket and the big ones in the other basket. When he was finished shellfishing, he would actually take the basket of small shellfish, and he'd walk around to the other side of the pond, and he would put them there. And then he would take the big basket and leave. He never took every single thing. You know, we always gave back. So when he'd come back, he wouldn't fish in the same spot that he fished, you know, at that time. He would go back to the other side, do the same thing. These are things that we've learned, not from books. These are things that we learned from our oral history. And that talks about our genetic connection to the land. You know, the land feeds us, and we nurture it. So you do have to forgive me a little bit on the formatting. But it says laws against our life ways. You know, we talk about what our cultural traditions are. We talk about what our customs are. A lot of times when we're brought into spaces, it's to talk about, you know, our dance and song. But there are life ways laws were made against our life ways. Again, following the caribou. Caribou, we know to right now is near extinction, or it is becoming extinct. The same thing with the buffalo, and same thing with the whale. And these were animals that we are genetically connected to. We have clans of, we have ceremonies for. They're part of our genetic makeup. And if these animals are dying because we are not able to practice our life ways, you know, that's pretty drastic. That's genocide. So we had foreign animals that were brought to this country, as well as plants. A lot of times we think about the clash of cultures, of people, but we often neglect the clash of environments sometimes that was brought over, the invasive plants to the indigenous plants. The same things that were happening to our people as far as diseases were also happening to our environment as well. As we begin to bring back our ceremonies and we begin to bring back these practice life ways, we're finding it very, very difficult to find things like cattail reeds versus phragmites. These are, you know, there are specific ceremonies that we had and specific uses that we had for certain plants. We were forced into institutions and indentured servitude. So when that happens, we leave the village, we leave the oral history, we leave our life ways. And when your child comes back at 21, not even knowing what a cattail reed is used for, you know, that kind of breaks what we've been practicing. The same thing with selling and leasing land. With the Shinnecock Indian Reservation particularly, you know, again, when I showed you that map, you see us actually living right now on what is known as the Shinnecock Indian Reservation. But there was an extension of land that we actually had. And so when we get into the conversation a little bit about relocation, where we would relocate was essentially our land that we were forced to sell and we were forced to give up. We also did controlled burns. A lot of that helped with the nitrogen in the soil. A lot of that also helped with, of course, the bugs, things of that nature. But we were able to have controlled burns. Again, that was something that we were forced to stop doing. We were forced to stop speaking our language. There are words in our language, there are words in the English language that do not exist in the Shinnecock language and that do not exist in indigenous languages. And so when we're forced to stop speaking our language, we're forced to actually have that verbal conversation with our environment that our ancestors once had. And then again, we were also forced to have fishing permits. So sometimes it's hard a little bit to talk about history. A lot of people get very uncomfortable, but I think it's a real thing that we do need to talk about. But one thing that is beautiful, I think, that we can all learn from is our coastal resurgence. Here's a photograph of several of us actually paddling in the Mystic River. This is one of our vessels. It's called the Moskehtu. Her name is Nukamis. This is the largest vessel that has been made in over 400 years. And we paddled this in the Mystic River. And again, our coastal resurgence, as canoe people, as coastal people, there's a lot of lessons and a lot of teachings within our Moskehtu ways. One, you have to burn a living tree. And in order for this vessel to survive, it has to be utilized. There are many marine archaeologists and scientists finding Moskehtus that have been buried underneath rivers and underneath waters, and everybody's trying to figure out, well, how is it still in existence if it was something from 1634, you know, in the Connecticut River? But these are things that if we take care of the environment, then the environment will take care of us. And that Moskehtu teaches you how to do it, because if you don't keep it alive, it will die, because it's a living vessel. It's a green tree, and it floats. And so we're bringing back our teachings around the canoe. We're having canoe races. Shavonne's going to get into a lot more on how we're actually doing a lot of coastal restoration for our habitat. But, you know, there are things that we're doing to be very, very resilient. And I think one of the things that I think all of us can learn from is having this indigenous voice, or these indigenous voices and indigenous presence, not only in the audience, but at the table. And I really thank you for inviting us to do that.
Okay, so thank you, Chenae. Again, my name is Siobhan Smith, and I work for the Shinnecock Environmental Department. Worked for the tribe since 2006. I started out in the aquaculture program. Currently, I'm the environmental director, and it's a big part of my job is the responsibility of identifying what are the risks to the community. I think that this conversation that we're having, it's very important. I hear the way it's being spoken of. I wasn't there last night, but there's almost a detachment. You know, the way it's being spoken about is very sterile. And so I think that's part of why we chose the topic of relocation as more than a new address. So this picture here is, that's actually the Shinnecock Indian Nation. And as you can see, it's a peninsula. The water's on 3 sides. We have Hetty Creek, Shinnecock Bay, and we have Old Fort Pond. At the bottom of the picture, that barrier island, on the very other side of that barrier island is the Atlantic Ocean. The time that we've been there and the time into the future is just, your location is what your culture is. So when you take a people that's all they've known is the waterways, and all they've known is the wetlands, and all they've known is the shellfish and the fishing and the land hunting, and now you're faced with the reality that you're going to have to relocate. I don't know if I like the word retreat, but if you have to relocate, it's something that we've had to do in history, right? So the piece that we're even on now, as Chenae spoke about, is way smaller than what we were used to. So the discussion is very delicate, and it's only been had briefly in the community. Like, people talk about it, and leadership has talked about it, and you've thought of the possibilities of where you could go. But it's not as simple as just a few people go. You'll be moving a whole nation. You'll be moving a whole community, you know, and when you leave the land that you're on, that's where our ancestors are buried. So there's a lot that goes into it, and so it's a very, very emotional discussion that has to be had, but it has to be had in the proper reverence, right? It's not just a sterile conversation. It's a real conversation, real people. So that being said, what we're facing on our peninsula, erosion, and like every other place, especially along the coastline, so it's not unique to us, it just is a little different for us. The resources to address it is what becomes different. So erosion, migrating wetlands, sea level rise. So what I thought I would do is I would speak about the ways that we're trying to prolong our existence on the peninsula and not have to relocate and not have to retreat. So one of the major things that we were doing was the, oh, I see the pictures down at the bottom. So we did a major shoreline restoration. So it was a 3-year project, and we received money from NIFWIF. the National Federation of Fish and Wildlife and Fish, because we were impacted by Superstorm Sandy, not hurricane. But anyway, so we received money to help us with the shoreline, and we had previously identified the erosion as one of our biggest concerns on our climate adaptation plan, because we do have one that was written in 2013. And so we're now in the process of updating it, and we're reassessing our vulnerabilities, and our priorities are shifting a little bit. But we did this shoreline restoration work, and we partnered with Cornell Cooperative Extension. And so we were, actually would have been better if this picture was larger. But the picture down in the bottom right-hand corner is what the shoreline looked like after the project. So it's 3,000 feet long, and the sand was pumped. They were doing a maintenance dredge on the inlet. So the inlet is that barrier island between Shinnecock Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. And so all that sand was pumped. It was like a 24-hour operation for 2 weeks. They did it in December, and they just had this huge pipe that came from over by that inlet and came up to the shoreline, and then they just slowly rolled it along the shoreline. And then you waited for it to settle, and then the bulldozers came in and they smoothed it all out. And then to secure the shoreline, so then we did a lot of planting. All that green you see there and the fencing is the plants that were hand planted there. So then in front of that, we did, I really wish I had thought I had a different picture. I apologize for that. But at the end, you'll see the video, and you'll see the complete overhead drone shot that will show you the beach planting, the sand, and then the rocks that went along the shoreline. So in this picture, the grayed out picture is actually, which is shell bag. So we received fossilized shell that was actually mined in Florida and shipped up, and then the people that worked on the project spent a lot of time just putting that in bags. So then once the bags were shelled, the shells were bagged. We went out on the barge just off of the shoreline, and we began to build an oyster reef. So the oyster reef is to help slow down the wave energy. So all the things we're doing is trying to keep the sand in place. So these shells, the start's over at Hetty Creek. And this photo is actually, Hetty Creek is on the eastern border of Shinnecock, and that's where we have an oyster hatchery that we're trying to revitalize. And part of that work is to not only grow oysters and seeds to sell for market, but we also do it for water quality. So for going on since 2013, 2012, well before that, but we've been reseeding Shinnecock Bay with oysters. And so these bags here, they're actually going to stay there because we're having the same type of erosion problem over here at Hetty Creek. So this is something that we're trying along here, and we put some oyster bags there to try and protect that shoreline in that area. I feel like I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. This is an overhead shot. So again, this is part of the shoreline, and in the middle there, that's actually our cemetery. So our cemetery is being impacted by wetlands and these tidal ponds that are growing on either side. So during the restoration project, what was done was in the shoreline, they did some trenching to try and, so the water would go in and it would get trapped and it would flood. But then it would take long to be able to drain out. So the hope was to put the trenches there and it would drain out quicker, and also to allow the fish to get in because we have like a big mosquito problem. And with all the illnesses that are coming up from all the vector-borne illnesses, we're trying to be mindful of things like that. So the next slide that we see here, this map actually was given to us. We've been working with the Nature Conservancy, and some of our future work is going to be more of this wetland monitoring. And so this is what it's projected. So as you can see, in addition to dealing with erosion, we're going to have the marshlands that are going to naturally migrate inward, which will lessen the area that we're able to live in. Currently, there's 650 tribal members that live on this 800-acre peninsula, and it's a lot of the homes are multi-generational. The entire tribe is 1,500 members, but everyone doesn't live there. That's by choice. So as there are people that do live along the edge here, and so part of the discussion is, when do you tell people that they can't build in those areas because of what's coming? And so then you get into the whole, it's a governmental thing. So we have our own government, and these are the types of discussions that you have to have with people, because people in the community get used to that sense of freedom. So you're like, oh, I want to live by the water, so I'm going to go build my house by the water. And you have to try to explain to them that it's really not a good idea because in a few years you're going to have issues. So all these are the discussions that we have to begin to have. And so I'm actually going to stop now because I think we're close to our time.
The video?
Yes. Is it going to play or you have to do it
I
separate?
have to do it separately.
So what we're going to show you right now is the video of the finished shoreline, and it was done with drone footage. And it's about 2 minutes long.
You just press play when you're ready.
Anyway, I'm going to press it right now so I don't take any more people's time. There is no music. It really is a silent film. I apologize. Chenae said, you're going to have them just stare for 2 minutes, and I said, yes, I am. But no, I can talk about it. So the area it's 3,000 feet long, and that's one of the trenches that I was telling you about at the cemetery. And another thing that was happening prior to us putting the sand there, our tree line was dying off. I mean, it was crazy. There was no sand. It was just a rocky shoreline. So yes, we're people of the stony shore, but it was like there was no sand. And so, and then these boulders here were placed in front of the beach, and in between the boulders, there's duck grass that's been planted. And so all this was in hopes of holding and slowing down the wave energy so that we could protect all the sand that was just put there. And along there, you'll see when you get close to the cemetery area is where we put this oyster reef. And the oyster reef we're actually continuing to still build. So we were part of New York State's Shellfish Restoration program, and so we had money to continue that work. So we're getting more bags, and we're just going to keep extending the oyster reef down. And that's coming up on the end of the project. It didn't do the whole shoreline, of course, because we have like, let's see, what did they, I'm not going to guess. But yeah. So I just wanted to show you, and so A, I love to show off Shinnecock's beautiful shoreline, and B, so you can see the amount of work that went into it. All those boulders had to be brought in. They're not naturally part of the Shinnecock shoreline, but they were sourced on Long Island, and they, like, huge boulders were just brought in, and heavy equipment was used to move it there. And then, like I said, hand planted. So in addition to the staff, we had lots of tribal members that came out and volunteered to hand plant all these little tiny transplants, Cornell staff. It was a very huge project, great source of pride for the nation, and all this to try and protect our homeland, to slow down what's inevitably happening to us. So that's the guy, Matt Ballard, actually operating the drone. And those poles right there, it's a funny story. The contractor was moving the sand. It's really not funny, but it was funny. He was supposed to just move sand along the shoreline, and what he ended up doing was digging like a 15-foot hole. He dug this huge hole into the bay, and it turned into like a whole DEC issue. And they had to go back, and what they did was put some of the extra boulders in the hole and then put sand on it, and we're just waiting for it to just, firm up. But we try to mark it off so people don't fall out into it. But yeah, I think I've covered what I wanted to cover. So, thank you. Thank you.
Is one of those websites the best one for people to go to see the?
ShinnecockEnvironmental.org is the department's website, and there's more footage of that project and all the other work that we do.
ShinnecockEnvironmental.org. Great, and this illustrates the value of co-design. When I was at National Geographic Society last year, we've been doing a lot of work with other organizations to build capacity on the ground in places like Amazonia to demarcate territory or to be resilient, and the more it's co-designed, the more it'll work. If you think you can come in with a boilerplate solution for a community, indigenous or not, you're going to miss some opportunities and create problems. So Richard Moss and Susanne Moser, why don't you both come up? I assume you're tag teaming. Everyone, if you don't know them both, well, again, they've both been involved in this for a very long time. Susanne, particularly, it was like 18 years into writing about climate change that I first interviewed a social scientist. It was all like biogeochemistry, and I realized, SHIT. This is the real problem, so come on up.
crooked, right? Great. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. What Richard and I want to do here this morning is to essentially try to put out a suggested framework for us to not get overwhelmed. I don't know if we're going to succeed with that, but we're going to try. Because what we heard just now is a great example of, doing something in one small place, and then we got 40,000 miles, depending on your desire of how you want to measure the U.S. coastline, where we're going to have to do that again. And we're going to have to do it in very different places with very different geologies, very different people, very different histories, and so on. And, you just put forward to us how big that problem is, how fast it's coming to us. We're going to have to speed up quickly, so it's very easily for us to get caught up. So I want to start by sort of broadening our vision to those other challenges, not to diminish at all what we just heard, but to simply say we have a problem in lots of places. So what you see here is Charleston, South Carolina. I was there last week for a climate change conference, and it was raining. It was raining a lot. In fact, the local papers started with words like this, almost poetic. It's going to be raining for the time being. And it just, the water doesn't have a place to go. It just stays in the streets. And so we were lucky we had the mayor come in, who is a very, very passionate guy. He's completely on board with working on climate change and on sea level rise in particular because, he's seeing where this is going until 2040. No one in Charleston talks to you about what is the plan for what we do after 2040. So totally on board. While we were doing that, everybody was kind of like on their little cell phones because the local TV station has developed an app where you can track, can you get from A to B? If you need to have a meeting uptown, if you need to go to the airport, can you get there? This is what we're looking at. If you can go to it right now, if you just look street flooding, Charleston, South Carolina, you can get the local conditions right now, and it's constantly permanently updated with the situation. Anyway, this is a town that is putting, while it's investing in pumps and dealing with that stuff, actually investing a lot more in more development. For the last 10 years, I've worked in the San Francisco Bay Area, in California more generally, but in particular in the Bay Area, with another really, really passionate, committed local leader, County Supervisor Kate Sears, who is, you can't find someone who's more on top of this and wants to do with it. And she has a fantastic staff, maybe some of, I don't know if they're here, I can't see them. But anyway, they're doing this and have been doing this for many, many years. And quietly behind closed doors, they would say, I can't tell you how we're going to deal with Route 1. Which is that one road, if you know the area, that gets you from Marin County into San Francisco and everybody else too. Nobody knows how to deal with Route 1. So Marin County is one of the most wealthy places in the United States, and it doesn't have an answer to the problem. Those are just to put out the areas, the range of challenges that we need to deal with, and we need to do this fast. We need to learn fast how to do this. Richard has the answer.
Thanks, Susie. I really appreciate that. So I want to start by thanking the ancestors on whose ground we're meeting, because I've been learning this past year about the importance of recognizing different ways of knowing and different kinds of traditions, and that's going to be a theme of what we talk about today, is expanding our ideas about assessment and our knowledge base that we assess and try to bring forward to support action. So in our pre-meeting for today, we had a little debate about whether Susie's first slides were going to be termed pessimistic or realistic, and I'll let you guys take your pick as to which, but it's clear that we have to have a plan if we're going to start to address this. And so Susie and I thought about kind of three dimensions of this and three different sets of timescales that we sort of are going to weave into our presentation. The first is to say that there are really limits to the viability of in situ adaptation, and we're not saying that people shouldn't work to stay where they are as long as they can for all the reasons that we just heard about from the Shinnecock tribe.
But there are eventually, for many locations, going to be a point at which you can no longer do that. And so that's one of the timescales and one of the considerations that we think people need to keep in mind as they start to do the second thing, which is to co-create development pathways that facilitate benign transitions. And this is a lot about the integration of knowledge and experience and culture with science so that those things are informed by a sense of what's going to happen over time, time-dependent scenarios of sea level rise and other things. But it really needs to be something that's thought of holistically, where you don't frame your conversation just as how do we stay, but you think of it as a bigger conversation about how do we survive and how do we thrive. And then the third element that we're going to talk about is focusing on collaborative learning that's about solutions, not just identifying problems. And that's a profound change. It's not just a thing that changes the table of contents in a report, but it really changes what knowledge is important. Because when you talk about solutions, it's not just science that says, here's the sea level rise projection. It's the experience that practitioners and the cultures can bring to understand how to be in a place. So very briefly, since we are short on time, just the limits to viability of indefinite in situ adaptation. We've talked about this already in the conference, and there are a number of papers that bring up some of these issues, the increasing physical risk, not only from the extreme scenarios, but even things like sunny day flooding, which do, as Susie just talked about, they create risks and issues for people, transportation systems being disrupted, people who work in one location not being able to get to their children to pick them up at the end of the day if the roads are closed, and so forth. Continued development trends, even absent sea level rise, the ways that we're continuing to pour people and capital into non-sustainable environments and using the environment non-sustainably would create its own problems. The recurrent demands of adaptation, you can see your dollar going down the drain there in the little icon. This is the National Flood Insurance Program is a poster child of this. We keep repaying for the same things, thinking that somehow if we just keep repaying for it, it's going to turn out differently. It won't. Equity and justice implications, not surprisingly, you look at tools like benefit cost analysis, which are set up to tell you where's the wealthiest, where are the richest and most expensive places, where are we going to end up putting the money to rebuild and to protect. It's going to be those places. It's not going to be the places where land values are lower and where poor people live. Demands on regional coordination came up last night. It would be unprecedented, and even here in New York, in the New York area where people are working on this, to get New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut to work on a problem like this together. I mean, I had the temerity to suggest it in a meeting last year when I was here, and people sort of looked at me like I was from Mars. It's not easy, and it's because people have to deliver results within the context of their own jurisdiction. And it's a risky thing to try to say, all right, well, let's pool our resources and see what we can get that way. And then finally, a lot of the adaptation measures that we're talking about end up having downsides. You put in a seawall, all of a sudden the thing that you were trying to protect, which was partly the attractiveness of the location and the view, is compromised. So over time, as things get worse and worse, and these intervention measures get more serious and disruptive, you're going to see those as well.
So I think, Katie, you said earlier we're behind the 8 ball already. So for us, given that this is sort of on the horizon, that we can't stay in place forever, and that the problems are already there, how do we get started on a path toward finding solution? And so the first thing you might want to say is, well, don't waste time. Let's just start talking about it. Let's try to frame up the conversation. Let's try to reimagine the coast. What could it be? And I think we're actually profoundly constrained in our imagination. I want to just make an emphasis here on this particular thing. When I ask people what they envision what the future could look like, well, it's either we're going to stay here, that's the Bloomberg response, or we're going to have a sea ball, but people can't imagine what it actually might look like, particularly in a positive sense. Before that often happens, before you can have a conversation as to what we're going to do over the long term, what you find is that people try to do a lot of things. They will be there for a while, and then they finally come to it. Typically, it's when you hit a limit, what people are willing to start having a bigger conversation. So we need to find ways and to actually get good at having these conversations to start framing us and start talking, not wasting time, and using that time wisely. So the kind of, in situ things that we just saw an example of this morning, we heard some of that last night, that actually buys us time to figure out the much bigger problems, right? It takes 20 years from the idea of having a seawall to getting one. 20 years. And we are on an exponential curve, and that time gets shorter and shorter. So we don't have a ton of time to actually waste and figure this out, much less to get the permits to move things, to move people to new places, to do it in any one of the ways of individual to community buyouts. I think at the same time, and we cannot forget this, we have a task of actually cracking the nut on this wicked problem of how to stop getting people into harm's way. Because, it's not just, okay, we're going to put this little piece here into perpetuity, into public domain, and it can't be rebuilt or whatever. But the drivers, the macro drivers of why we're all flocking to the coast, they're actually still there. You can't fix that at the local level, right? So how do we begin through cross-scale coordination of policies to actually, direct people, nudge people, as the word that was used earlier, move them toward safer places? And I don't say safe because I don't think we have that luxury anymore. And then actually there is that actual task of moving people out of harm's way. Letting, yesterday we brought it up, the species piece is in there as well. That is so huge and so complex, and there's new problems to deal with. And then, what are we going to leave behind, right? And it's not just who are we leaving behind, but is it our ruins that we leave behind? The toxic, the refineries, the burial grounds, the whatever, all those things that, landfills that we have in places right now on the coast. What are we doing with that? What is our approach to actually thinking that through for the future? Might not be the first thing we need to think about. This is just to structure that. But that is a set of tasks that might help us structure sort of, how to think about what we need to deal with here, and in 2 years when you have the conference again, what we need to think about then, and so on and so forth for the next 3,000 years.
A small time frame. So that's the second element of what we were talking about, thinking about these things in an integrated pathway. And the third is about collaborative learning. That is driven by the need and the urgency and the opportunity that exist in different communities. And so what we're talking about here is something is really in the province of how do people synthesize what they've learned, how do we extend beyond what's done in one place, learn lessons from it that may be replicable or usable in others. And the science community has often thought about this process of collaborative learning as Katharine described it, as assessment. And what we're talking about is based on a project I worked on here last year to extend the current U.S. National Climate Assessment from the sort of analysis of risks to solutions. And it involves three principal things: focusing on challenges and solutions that communities across the country are working on. So rather than having chapters, for example, about the Northeast or water resources and focusing primarily on risks, you're looking much more at things like creating communities that are resilient to fire risk or to flooding, where you're trying to really come up with the solutions for that. The second thing is to try to change how we work, and I'm going to show just a quick example of that in a moment, but instead of just having the science community draft these reports and present them, we want to create communities of practice where people working on problems and scientists work side by side together in a prolonged way so that people both understand the content of the science, but the scientists understand the context of action. And then the third thing, which is depicted here, is that we want to go into this problem of action and implementation. And what you can see here is a circle of a typical adaptation plan or implementation plan for a project that starts with framing, goes into identifying risks and opportunities, designing options, appraising and making decisions, enacting those decisions, and monitoring and reevaluation. And what we often think of ourselves doing in the science community is providing decision support, which really just focuses on a couple of these areas. And for example, the National Climate Assessment is really right now focused on identifying risks and opportunities, and a lot of the decision analysis is focused down at that making decisions place. We need to provide action support, because we're beyond the point of just making decisions. And one of the things we heard was a lot of communities will develop an adaptation plan, they'll work through all of this, and then things stall. So they aren't able to get the financing, they haven't been able to figure out which of the engineering designs that is proposed is going to be more robust. All kinds of really practical questions where science can make a big difference, but right now the information and the knowledge and insight is being left on the table. So, and then very briefly, so if you think about the way we produce these reports, is typically, there'll be maybe some kind of meeting of joint framing where we work out the outline or the questions, but then the science community kind of goes off and does its thing. In these communities of practice, what we envision is sustained long-term interactions and partnerships that help not only to produce knowledge, but create communities. Because so much of what you hear from practitioners is they feel isolated in their community. They don't have a broader context. They'd like to learn from what others are doing. Those communities of practice would be organized around a shared challenge and would include engineers and architects, lawyers, community members, as well as scientists, and then that group of people who exist in organizations like RISA as intermediaries. And the whole point is to work on these scientific challenges together, come up with tested or best practices, but also create the community of people to work together.
Let's include the social scientists too. Two social scientists speaking to you. Never mind. So now let's combine these two ideas. We have these different tasks over time to, if we imagine ourselves having to move back from the coastline in some ways, and for each one of these phases, there will be different things that we have to do and accomplish, different problems to solve. There will be certainly different actors involved, different challenges, different engagement needs, different communication needs. I want to give you a couple of examples of what that might look like, and then we'll close off. Here is just the first one around how do we talk about this? How do we frame it? Which is probably the most important thing, right? Because you can shut the conversation down if you really drop this one. So imagine the first thing is actually maybe a task for us social scientists and community practitioners working together to figure out what does the community care about? What are the attitudes, opinions, the values of what matters to this community? How ready are they to have this conversation? We might not know this as scientists. We might have to really work here closely with the community. But in the meantime, physical scientists can help very much, because you know what I've learned over 20 years of communication? If you come in with just a problem without a solution, or with even a hint at someone working at a solution, the conversation ends. Someone ought to already be working on opening up the solution space just as a way to hold the space for the conversation. There are tons of legal, engineering, economic research that needs to be done for the next phase in that sequence that I showed you earlier. How to effectively facilitate those public dialogues, difficult dialogues, visioning together with the community, developing initial adaptation pathways. How do we buy that time before we get to that point? Those are the kinds of tasks that might be really important early on. And that means we have to actually focus on capacity building right there and then. Leadership development, fostering understanding of what transformational change is. How do you do visioning effectively? How do you hold difficult dialogues? Counsel. We can learn so much from traditional cultures and how to do that right. And then actually getting to a decision point where you work toward agreements on what's your 10-year plan, your 20-year plan, your 500-year plan, essentially, right? That's what we're talking about. And you can say, yeah, nobody does that. Well, maybe that is what the challenge is, to actually get to a vision that we're not here just for the next investment cycle. Then turning that into policy, establishing accountability metrics so it actually happens, and establishing the infrastructure for watchdogging that it does, and maintaining that dialogue over time. So that's just for that first phase, a very different set of tasks that we have. Let me take you just for just to broaden your vision of, what we might be leaving behind if we don't deal with it, is removing the hazardous legacies of having lived on the coast in the disastrous way that we have. What do we need to do there? Well, one of the first things is to actually think about, how do we think about that? Is it a matter of public health and economics, or is it an ethic of a million-year stewardship, and that's what we get to restore? The community gets to decide where they come in on that, right? It has practical and it has inspirational pieces to it, and I think we need both. There is a ton of things that can be done for that piece of the work. Imagine just what we need to do just to identify what are we leaving behind, the toxic, the Superfund sites of the future, if you will. And how do we prioritize? Do we do that one community at a time, on a regional scale, whatever? There is a ton of work for applied engineering. How do you recycle New York City? Just think about that, just to open your imagination. Remediation of those places, and whose responsibility is it? Who's going to pay for that? What are the legal levers to get anyone to do that? Imagine, you have to think about it, right? The taxpayers will have left, right? Someone's got to pay for this after the ones of us who pay for it have left. So who's going to be responsible for that? So developing those financial options, figuring out what the options for remediation are, the alternative uses for those spaces. Where are we going to put this stuff? I don't know, grinding it up, building new reefs. I don't know, there's great possibilities. And how do you decide on that? How do you coordinate that? Or who is it delegated to? I guess, in a way, we're building here a 21st century public works program with a very long-term commitment. We don't have that kind of long-term commitment. Think about how difficult it is for us to store nuclear waste, right? That's the sort of time scale, 100,000 time scale. And then we all know how difficult it is to get long-term funding for monitoring evaluation. How long is long enough? When do we say, okay, we're done here now? This is going to be fine. When are we going on? So that's our challenge. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
And this is the next to last slide. It's just a word cloud we created based on the abstracts for the conference. And it's really, it's interesting because, as Radley noted last night, there's a lot in here that is about action. There's a lot in here that is about community. And it's sort of about a reframing of this from a simply defined, I shouldn't say simply, but concretely defined issue of sea level rise to really thinking about all of the ramifications of that. And what we're suggesting, I think, in our presentation is not that we have the right way to try to start to synthesize the knowledge that's necessary to do this, but that we have to move beyond the sort of just cloud of worries and ideas into something that's more structured and accessible for people who are trying to use it, and that it does involve a profound change in how we think about the process of assessment. We've set up a new organization called Science for Climate Action Network, and we are going to launch as one of our first projects a focus on coasts, and that's something which I hope to be able to say more about later. So with that, we thank you and look forward to the conversation.
So panelists, can you come up? Race up, so we have time. We have time for about 15 minutes of discussion and Q&A and action points. One thing I wanted to offer very quickly, given both the time scale, as Richard said, or maybe it was Susie, this is a new normal thing. It's developing a capacity that isn't a one-time fix, which is, I think, I just saw a tweet from Bob Kopp earlier on the mitigation side. This is a long-term journey we're on here. So how do you normalize this stuff, I think, is a big part of what you're talking about. I recently was speaking and asked this question: if you had to choose the word from the words climate adaptation or adaptability, which would you choose?
For what?
Adaptability, meaning capacity to adapt.
Right, well, I think...
As opposed to adaptation to X.
Well, I think you need both. I mean, adaptation to short-term climate variability looks different than it does to long-term climate change. So I think, adaptability is what you need, but you do have to think about what it is that you're adapting to. So I don't think you can just take the word climate out.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, when you know that you have centuries of sea level rise, that's a specific thing. But for the community, broad community engagement on that, the capacities that are necessary to think, to connect, to share knowledge, to challenge, false presentation seems important. It's kind of a capacity or trait. So I want to just quickly say, from what you've heard from others on the panel, we'll just stick down the row here. What comes to mind that's a new thought or crystallizing sense of something that can be done by the people at this table here and who might be connected by social media? So what's the gap? Richard mentioned one, this climate science. Let's make climate science useful thing, like Thriving Earth Exchange, the American Geophysical Union has had for a number of years. I'm hoping to work with them to see if we can make it bigger and better. So what do you, Katharine, was there something that you felt glaringly can be done that isn't done yet? Thinking about what you're hearing.
Great. I mean, I think all of the presentations really highlighted some of the core themes that are relevant to all of adaptation or increasing preparedness or supporting capacity for change in the changing climate. I think one that really jumped out at me is that historically we've done way more in the talking space, in the planning space, and I think the real question is how do we actually implement, not just one by one, but in a one by one way that can be replicated or in a way that can be scaled and much faster. So I think this idea of adapting to change cuts against the thrust of how settlements have developed in many locations over the past decades and centuries, and I think that question of actually taking action and learning and going faster is a really wide open pressing question, in some ways the biggest limit we're facing at present.
And from the standpoint of the Shinnecock, what comes to mind? What are you missing, or what do you want to share that you haven't found an effective way to share yet? Thinking about this, your experiences there so far.
This is on, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, no, just listening to the other presentations, they were wonderful, and I've enjoyed listening. I'm trying to, I guess there's a part of me that I become very concerned about the after effect, right? So we're talking about relocate, even if you're not talking about a tribal community, but you're talking about a neighborhood, people who have known each other a long time. They create social bonds, they create networks, they become to rely on each other. It's familiar, it's home. And so now, you're talking about, I'm not saying it's not necessary. It's not necessary to have the conversation, but I need to feel like there's a little more human understanding that you are actually impacting lives when you're sitting down and you're making these plans. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll just take this neighborhood and we'll move it over here. So what happens when you take Jimmy from out of his familiar area and you put him over here with new people that maybe don't have anything in common with him? So culture isn't just tribal culture. Everybody has culture. Everybody has something that they relate to that makes them who they are. So I think this conversation needs to really, really include what is the mental health after, right? That's a big sociologist, right? Sociology. That's a big part of it. And I just don't feel like I'm really hearing it. So maybe I'm missing it. But I think it's a big enough audience where we need to begin to talk about that. The human side of retreat, since that's the word we're using.
I was just in New Orleans recently, and I went out to visit the Ile Saint Charles tribal community. It's a long name. The Biloxi.
Tunica-Biloxi.
Say it louder.
The Tunica-Biloxi.
Yeah, and one thing they're eager to do is to create kind of a memorial, sort of a historical presence. And I was thinking with some people there about an AR, VR experience that can live on Google Earth. So even as the ocean 100 years from now is much further inland, there's this place you can see and visualize. Any coastal community can have that sort of at least engagement with the memory and saving that part of their identity. If you do something like that.
Well, I'll have to say that, from a historical standpoint, a lot of us have heard of the Trail of Tears. but a lot of people don't really know what happened or what's happening to indigenous people because of the Trail of Tears. You have states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma. Oklahoma has a large amount of indigenous people that were forced to be there. They relocated from their original areas. And just like Siobhan was saying, what is the effects of that? You know, if you take communities that never got along and we've always warred with one another, and we're outside of having a seat at the table to be a part of the planning, and they're saying, okay, well, this is where we're going to place you, this is where we're going to place you, this is where we're going to place you. That's exactly what happened during the Trail of Tears. It's already happened. And I don't think that we, as a collective of communities, cultures, nations, governments, should dictate to one another. I think that we need to bring our representation in the planning space. And that's something that, you know, our governments are always talking about: consultation, trust, responsibility. These are things that in many areas of our government, from being environmental to economical development to health, to education, that we don't have that place. So when I hear we are planning, I hear they are planning, you are planning. I don't hear we are planning. And as a historian, to know that and to still see the effects of the tribes today, and to be very close with just individuals and to hear their experiences. Yes, the map that I shown earlier was our sister tribes, but we're divided by states. So we have to individually deal with the state of New York versus Connecticut, Rhode Island, and so forth, but we share this body of water. So when we're talking about zoning and laws of that nature, I just think that we need to look at history and see, well, because of what has been done with history, we're kind of where we're at right now with climate change. You know?
There's an expression geographers have that the side with the best map wins. And I know there's a great indigenous map of
Just like
North
they
America.
say, draw the map, be the one that draws the map.
Yeah, and so concretizing that reality as a way for people outside indigenous communities to explore the history of landscapes would be really interesting, something that someone might work on. And just the last, Richard and Susie.
I'll just be really quick. I think that one of the things I'd love to see
there
more
are a couple
of
questions
is
from the
framing this in a broad and integrated way. I think there's so much that's kind of strategy by strategy or little piece by little piece, whether it's what you're going to do to try to manage the recurrent floods, you know, in a small way, but not thinking about the bigger picture of where is this going to go on what time frame. And it puts a real pressure on science to try to continue to improve our understanding and narrow uncertainties about long-term change, because that's a real, you know, very debilitating uncertainty for people. What can they do for how long before they want to decide how much do they want to invest in buying time? But we need to have this as a broad conversation that also really does much more to privilege where communities want to be, so that they can think about, given these constraints, here's where we can go.
I think that what I would add to the notion of broadening the framing is, for me, when I take the really, really big view of what we're facing, it's a cultural transformation on every level. And it does have to include the emotional side. If it doesn't, we're not going to go anywhere. We're just going to be stuck. It has to include the economic system, the racist systems that got us into the exploitative system. So what we heard last night about regenerative economies, I think those are the places where that takes us, and that's maybe the broadest framing. And I think we don't, at least in Western modern society, we've lost a lot of knowledge of what that means and what that transformation from an archetypal perspective looks like. Mm-hmm. It means a lot of letting go. It means ending stupid things. And a lot of things we actually loved having, a lot of things we have been attached to. And it involves grappling at the deepest levels with some of the deep historical legacies that we've created. Right. And then there comes renewal too. There comes a new creation of some other shape that we don't even know yet. But that to me is what this reimagining the coast is really all about. And it's just one geography in which we have to do that.